Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, which is a dynamic approach on managing project risks. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Ahmed Rashid. I'm the Deputy Managing Director of Virginia Institute. I'm also the Project Management Principal, and I will be your webinar host today. So let me start by sharing some webinar logistics here, and then we start our interesting journey on how to manage a project risks. So the duration of our webinar will be 1 hour, hopefully, not more than that. I know it is Thursday, and you are all keen to start your weekend, so I promise you, you will not get bored, and you will find the webinar very beneficial for you and your organization. If you have any questions, please make sure that you type them on the Q&A chat, and I'll make sure to answer all your questions. I will try to stop every 10 to 15 minutes and catch up with all your questions. And we will be recording this webinar, and after we finish the webinar, you will receive an email with a link so that you can download the webinar in case you want to rewatch it again, because I will share with you many templates and something that you might refer to in the future, and also you can share it with your colleagues. At the end of the webinar, we'll share with you a 1 minute quick survey. Your feedback is very important for us, and also you will receive a webinar certificate of attendance. In case you face any technical issue, please send a comment on the chat. I'm also having my colleague and our operation manager, Miss Amal. She is going to handle your request and forward your questions to me and handle any technical issues that you might face. So I hope you can all hear me. Can you all confirm that you are hearing me? You can raise your hands. You can send yes on the chat if you wish. Okay, very good. That. In case we have any technical issues, just let us know during the webinar. So let me start with the most important basic terminologies that relate to risk and the project risk management. I want to make sure that we are on the same page and to introduce the most important three risk terminologies that they will be the foundation for our dynamic approach on how to manage a project risks. So many of you are familiar with these terminologies, but I just want to make sure that we are on the same page here and we understand these terminologies clearly. So the first term I want to share with you is risk event. So what is risk event? A risk event basically is description of uncertain future scenario or scenarios that will have an impact on our project. Risk event is always associated with uncertainty. Uncertainty at different levels, because when we are working on our project, executing them, we are uncertain of the outcomes. We are uncertain of the influence, the factors that influence these outcomes. We are uncertain of the events, probability or impact on our project. So remember that the risk event is just the uncertain scenario that we might encounter on the project. Now, when this uncertain event or condition impact our project positively or negatively, we start referring to it as a project risk. So project risk is the uncertain event or condition that if it happens, it will definitely impact our project objective. I want to emphasize here that the impact can be positive or negative. Many organizations, many project practitioners only look at risk from negative perspective, but risk can be positive, and we start referring to it as opportunities, as we will see later on. And that lead us now to the third element and third term, which is basically the core of our webinar today, project risk management. So project risk management is the method or methodologies that you will use in order to make sure you manage your project risks. What does it mean? If I have positive risk, I want to make sure that they will happen. So I will apply some strategies that will enhance these opportunities occurrence, enhance their impact to me. And if they are negative, I want to make sure that I eliminate them or avoid them. So project risk management is a proactive science, a proactive methodology, not a reactive one, because we want to make sure that we are responding to risks before they even happen. We don't want to wait until things happen to react to it. That will become more of crisis management and firefighting. So those three terminologies will be the basis for our dynamic approach. So many organizations, by the way, they are shifting now from the term of risk management to use the term of uncertainty management. I will write it here on my screen so that you can see it. And Always remember it, because they want to emphasize that when you refer to risk management as uncertainty management, it means you are uncertain of the outcomes of the risk events, and they can be positive or negative. Having it always as risk management, perception is about only negative aspects when it comes to risk management. So you want to make sure that you also think of positive things. I want to share with you a quick question here before we proceed with our dynamic approach. Let's see if you answer yes or no, and then I will share the results of the poll with you. So take a second and please answer the question that will appear on your screen. Okay, great, great. So the question was, do you have a formal approach for managing project risk, a standard, a methodology that you are following? And I will end the poll now. I'm still waiting for all to respond with a yes or no. Okay, almost there. Interesting. As of now, the majority are answering yes. Okay, let me share the results with you now. Okay, so you can see 94% of the attendees, almost like 15 voted that yes, we do have a formal approach. Why do we need to do that? This webinar is all about standardizing the approach to risk management, project risk management. We don't want to have every project practitioner in our organization applying and following their own risk methodologies, because that will create chaos. Imagine that you have 10 project managers, everyone is managing projects the way they think is correct or appropriate. We don't want this to happen. So we want to standardize the process, the methodology on how to manage our project risk. And to do that, this is what we will start doing. We will follow an approach, a methodology that you will find interesting and easy to follow on how to have effective project risk management. Do remember, please, that there is nothing called a risk-free project. Risk is always there, whether we like it or not. But the idea, how can we effectively manage our project risks? That's the whole concept that we are going to share with you. So let me start now summarizing risk as a function, as a mathematical formula, and this formula will live with us until the end of our webinar. So always remember that risk is a function of two components: likelihood, which can be referred to as a probability, and consequence, which can be referred as an impact. Every single day of our lives, we always assess risk using likelihood and consequence. Even if you want to cross a street, you always assess the likelihoods and consequences before you cross the street. So every time we enter into a risk process, basically what we are doing, we are updating this formula. So we will start in a while talking about how to identify risks on our project without assessing probability and impact. And then later on, we'll do what we call qualitative and quantitative risk assessment. So we'll look at the likelihood and consequence of every risk listed on our risk register. So remember that when you assess the risk, we said that the risk as a function will be probability multiplied by impact. And that will give us what we call a risk score. So we will do quantitative and qualitative risk analysis for every risk identified on our risk register. And then once we add all the risk scores on the risk register, that will give us the project total risk score, where we can compare different projects, the risk on each one of them, and we can diversify, our portfolio of projects and such. So every time what we will do, we'll talk about the likelihood and consequence. Sometimes we are more interested on the consequence, sometimes on the likelihood. When we define the project risk management, remember we said it's all about making sure that we want the good things to happen on our project. How can we do that? By actually increasing our likelihood and consequence of all the positive risks that are listed on our risk register. And at the same time, we want to make sure that we get away from the bad things that might impact our projects. To do that, we need to reduce the likelihood and consequence of our project risks. So later we will develop some strategies. Some of these strategies will deal with the positive risks to increase their likelihood or consequence, and some of these strategies will deal with the negative risk to make sure that we decrease their likelihood and consequence. So just thought to share with you and summarize risk as a function. It's a probability times multiplied by impact. And before we start the dynamic approach, it's imperative for us to understand the difference between risk and issue. When we refer to an item on the risk register as a risk, remember that it still has a probability of between 0 to 100. It means it did not happen yet. It did not occur. As long as it did not occur, it still has a probability less than 100 or a 1. So we refer to it as a risk. And definitely there will be a consequence which is negative or positive, and the time frame for it will be in the future. However, on the other hand, if we refer to something as an issue, it means that the risk already happened, occurred, and that's why the probability becomes equal to 100 or a 1. And the consequence is there, but the impact might be in the future. So the difference between risk and issue is that an issue is something that already happened, or for sure we are certain it will happen in the future. A risk means that it still did not happen. This webinar is all about how to deal with the project risks, which still has a probability to happen. Issue usually goes to issue logs and has a different path other than what we will share with you during this webinar. Some organizations, by the way, they use a third terminology here, which is a problem. A problem is the same as an issue. The only difference is that if it exists, it happened already, we are seeing the effect of the risk, then this becomes a problem because the time frame is happening now. However, an issue sometimes might refer to something that did not happen yet, but for sure it will happen, such as a supplier, a vendor emailing us, telling us that we will not be able to meet a certain deadline. We sure that this will happen, but it did not happen yet. So this is the difference between issue and a problem. So I'll start now sharing with you the dynamic approach. So when I say dynamic, it means that there will be certain processes that we need to follow to ensure that we effectively manage a projects on our project risks. So let me share them with you on the screen and then give you a quick overview, and then we carry on with each one of them. So you can see that these are 6 steps. Now, most international standards, they have these 6 steps under same terminology, or sometimes they combine some of these steps. So whether you are adopting the ISO standard for risk management, or the PMI, Project Management Institute, American standard, or the Prince2 or Management of Risk adopted by UK standard, they all use the same more or less approach. These steps or processes are not sequential. It doesn't mean that we will finish plan risk management and then we will move to identify risk and then we forget about identify risk and move on and carry on. It means they are dynamic, that every now and then at certain milestones in our project, during project execution, monitor, control, even until project closing, we will always use and follow these steps. So we always identify risks, even if we are towards the end of our project, because we never can anticipate what might happen until the end of the project. So the approach is dynamic because this is not static. You need to be having these as repeating processes. So plan risk management, the output of it will be the risk management plan that I will show you a template in a while. It will tell us how we are supposed to carry on our risk activities on the project. What methodologies are we going to use? What are the definitions of a probability and impact that we adopt in our organizations and such? Once we finish the first step and move to the second step, then the major output here will be our risk register. This is the most important document in project risk management, as many of you are aware. Basically, this document, project document, will be updated once we move from one step to another. So every time we are finishing one step, we again update the risk register. So when we identify the risk, we will only list our risks, and then after that we decide to do a quantitative or a qualitative risk analysis, or both of them. We will update the risk register with the probability and impact of risks, and then we start developing response strategies to handle positive and negative risk, and then we monitor risk using different tools and techniques that I will be sharing with you. So please keep in mind that these are not sequential in nature, but rather they are dynamic. We need to follow them. Not always in every project we need to do all 6 steps. Sometimes our projects are simple, straightforward, and we can skip qualitative, for example, or quantitative, and just identify the risk and develop responses. Sometimes the project complexity is very high and the stakeholders' interest in the project is very high, so we need to do quantitative and not qualitative. So we'll talk about differences between all these steps once we start. But this is an overview of the project risk management methodology that I will share with you today. You'll find it very interesting because I will be sharing templates here and there every step, and some tools and techniques that can help you to effectively manage each one of these steps. So before we start, are there any questions? I want to check if there are any questions before we start the process. And we start with the first step. Any questions? If you have any questions, please, you can just type them in the Q&A chat, and I'll make sure that I will answer them. I hope my voice is clear and you are ready now for an interesting journey on how to dynamically manage our project risks. So let us start with the first step, which is risk management planning. I'm sure you all heard before the saying, if you don't plan, if you fail to plan, then a plan to fail. And this is true in a project planning and risk management. 80% of risk is all about management, is all about planning so that you can save later on during execution of the project. I have okay, I have from Hassan a very interesting question. So how can we decide if we need qualitative or quantitative? There are certain criteria that I will share with you, Hassan, in due time. And also, it really depends on different factors. There are pluses for each one of them. We're not saying that qualitative is better than quantitative, but some factors can influence your decisions, such as the project time frame. Are you in a hurry to finish the project or not? The complexities on the project, the stakeholders' interest. Is this a new project for you or your team? Is it strategically important for you and the organization? We'll talk about different plus advantages for quantitative over qualitative and the other way around. So when we come to analysis, I will answer this question in depth because it is important. So let me start with the risk management planning. Here, what I will share with you is very simple, just a risk management plan. I'm hoping that many of you are having a risk management plan. When I visit many of my clients, I ask them, can you show me your risk management plan? And immediately they show me the risk register. Risk register is not the same as risk management plan. The risk register is a document where you record all your risks and then start analyzing them, their probability, impact, and develop strategies and such. But a risk management plan is something more generic, is something that is important because it tells everyone how are you planning to manage risks on your project. Here you don't have risks listed about your project. Here you have more about strategy, methodologies, and such. I will show you a template, but before that, very quickly, you need to have a risk management plan that includes more or less these components. So you'll have to talk about the methodology that you are adopting in managing your project risks. For example, you can say we are adopting in the organization the PMI methodology that can be summarized under risk identification, quantitative, qualitative, and such. Or you can say that our methodology is the UK standard methodology and such. You need to talk about the roles and responsibilities. So here you don't have to share names or list any names. For example, you can say that every project in our organization need to have the role of a risk owner, and we need to have the role of risk action owner, the person who will be taking the action. However, the risk owner is the person responsible for the risk. You need to include something related to risk categories. Are we going to categorize risks in our project based on a project life cycle, like risks related to initiation, planning, executing, and such? Or is it per department, risks related to technical department, marketing, accounting, and such? Or is it per phase? So this is important because at a later stage, we might develop one strategy to handle a risk category, or we might think to outsource a risk category and transfer the risk to an insurance company or a contractor or a vendor. So it's very important to understand how to categorize your risks. And one of the most important and interesting areas in the risk management plan is the risk appetite, the stakeholders' risk appetite. Remember, each one of us as individuals or even as organizations, we have different risk appetites, different risk tolerance, or different risk attitudes. And this can really impact the way you manage your project risks. If your CEO, for example, have a very high tolerance for risk, they have risk appetite for risk. So that means when you are dealing with the risks, you'll see that you are more inclined to adopt the strategies of enhancement, of exploiting opportunities. You look at risks as opportunities. On the other hand, if the CEO or the project sponsor having more of a risk averse attitude, which means that they don't like risk. They try to avoid it at all costs. You will see that this will be also reflected on your response strategies, and you will adopt more of avoidance and mitigation strategies. We also need to be very clear about the definitions of risk and the probability. What do we mean when we say that this risk has low probability of happening, or medium, or high? And that need to be defined. And this also will help us in order to design the heat matrix, or what we refer to as probability and impact matrix. And then, of course, we need to talk in the report how we are going to report the status of risks on our projects and how to track risks on our projects. So remember, a risk management plan, you will develop it at the beginning of the project, and it will be part of the master project management plan, updated whenever the project management plan is updated as well. But the document that we will depend on to manage the project risks is the risk register. I prepared here a quick risk management plan. Let me open it and show it to you. So this is a quick, template for a risk management plan. And by the way, I'll be sharing 3 or 4 templates with you. If you are interested in them, let me know by the end, and I will of the webinar, and I'll make sure to share it with you, email it to you. So, and you can use it. There are no copyrights here. We developed this, and you can use it. So the risk management plan, as I shared earlier with you, it should contain sections like the methods and the approach. How are you going to manage risk? So you need to talk about whether you are including quantitative, qualitative, other processes and such. Then any tools and techniques you will be using, the roles and responsibilities we talked about. And again, I emphasize, no need to list any names here, just the role and the responsibility. For example, one of the roles will be the risk owner, and what are the responsibilities of a risk owner on your project. The categories that I mentioned earlier, you need to be able to categorize your project risk. And by the way, you can follow the WBS, work breakdown structure categories, in order to categorize your risks, and it becomes what we call RBS, risk breakdown structure. You also need to have it say here, describe the stakeholder risk tolerance. A very important part of the risk management plan is what I mentioned earlier, the definitions of a probability and impact. So if we update the risk register with a risk and we say it has a low likelihood to happening, that means according to our organization definition of low, it will have a probability less than 50% of occurrence. And if we say, for example, it has a high impact, then that means it will impact my project budget more than 25%. So remember, this will be influenced actually by the stakeholder tolerance. The stakeholder tolerance to risk, if they are more of averse or seeker to risks, this will be influenced by their risk attitude. And many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with different project domains, scope, quality. So you need to define, what do you mean when you say that there will be an impact on the scope or the quality or different project areas? And the most important and famous heat matrix, many of you are using it. So you'll have a heat matrix. Usually we use the traffic lights to indicate different levels of risk. So we plot the risk scores on the matrix to see if we are doing good or not. So the green will indicate, of course, that we are having some risks, but it's being dealt with and it will not have major impact on the project. The yellow or amber color sometimes we use, it means that we need to be cautious. And the red color, it might be indicating that the risks are too high and we might decide to cancel the project. This heat matrix, by the way, can be applied on individual risks and on a project risks as a total. And if you are using a 3-point scale, low, medium, high, I was saying that you can use the 3-point scale, but what is more accurate usually if you use a 5-point scale. For example, you can add low, low to medium, medium to high, and that will give you more accurate results. So this is basically a template for risk management plan I wanted to share with you, and then you can talk about the risk audit approach. So remember, the risk management plan is important at the beginning of the project, but then after that, we depend on the risk register. So I will stop here for a few minutes to answer any questions regarding the risk management plan, if you have, before we move to the second step. Any questions you have on the first part? Before we proceed to the second step, there is something called risk tolerance, as I said. So I just wanted to make sure that you understand what does it mean, a risk tolerance. So remember, risk tolerance, or we refer to it sometimes as risk attitude or appetite, it is how much you as an individual or as an organization willing to withstand risk. And you can get a feeling of the risk tolerance from different sources here. So for example, many organizations, they have their enterprise environmental factors, which basically refers to policies and procedures and such. So from it and looking at past historical projects, you can tell if the stakeholder have high tolerance or not. And we usually have psychometrics and tools, advanced one, that we share with project stakeholders and team members to understand the risk tolerance. What does it mean? Using the tool or software can tell us if the stakeholder is a risk averse, which means they try to avoid risk at all costs, or are they risk neutral? They are indifferent about the project risks, or are they risk seeking? They look at risks as challenges and as opportunities. This is very important to understand because, as I said, at a later stage, when you start considering response strategies, these strategies will be influenced by your stakeholders' appetite to risk and to project risks. And that concludes the first step. The most important thing to understand here, that to plan risk management, you need to have a risk management plan that summarizes the methodologies, the definitions that you will use for probability and impact, and a few more details. You don't need to apply this risk management plan on every project. If the project is straightforward, easy, you can just use the risk register to manage your project risks. But for complicated projects, for advanced one, projects that has a duration more than 1 year, for example, or even more than a few months, we need to have a stakeholder a risk management plan. Okay, so let me check the questions and then we move to the risk identification. Okay, so there is a question about the matrices that we might use, which is better, 3 or by 3, 5 by 5 or higher. Honestly, many organizations, Ali, they use different matrices for different types of projects. So for IT projects, for example, maybe the risks are higher, so they use 5 by 5 grids because it gives them more accurate results and more flexibility in plotting the risk scores. 3 by 3 is the standard, the common one. Most organizations, they have low, medium, and high. I would recommend not to adopt only one heat matrix. You should have more than one depending on the project category or complexity of the project. So some organizations, it depends on the industry. If their project is in automotive industry, it's not the same as aviation, not the same as tourism or such. So you need to have more, flexibility here by adapting more than one heat matrix. The risk management plan actually will tell you which heat matrix are we going to apply on this specific project that we are working at. Now, who developed the heat matrix? Usually it is given to you by the organization, by your executive, and it depends and is influenced by many factors. One of them is the appetite to risk, their tolerance to risk. So I hope I answered this question. So now we move to risk identification. Now you start looking at risks that might happen on your project and start recording them on the risk register. You have many tools in order to identify risks, and I'm sure that many of you identified risks before on their projects. But what I will do here, I will share with you one or two important ideas when it comes to risk identification. So when you identify the risk, you will use some tools to gather the data, and then you will use some tools to analyze the data and check the risks on your project. So many of you are familiar with brainstorming, for example. Brainstorming is a very effective method to identify risk, and according to the Project Management Institute, they consider brainstorming and interviews as the most effective tools on identifying project risks. Brainstorming can come in different formats. The most famous one can be the freewheeling brainstorming, which means that we have a dynamic session where we ask the project team members, what do you think might go wrong or good in this project? And it's unorganized because everyone will share whatever they have in their mind. And we do have a facilitator and some brainstorming mechanisms about the duration and about recording the output of the brainstorming. But you can make it more organized by using what we call like a slip technique or a round-robin technique. Round-robin technique refers to a very organized method of brainstorming. So you start by each individual on your project team and ask them, what do you think are the risks that can happen on this project? So everyone is allowed to share one idea at a time to make sure that everyone is involved in the brainstorming session. If there are so many personality clashes sometimes and personal issues between team members, we can ask them actually to record all their risks and concerns about the project on sticky notes, and then we use what we call affinity diagrams and put them on the wall and start categorizing them. Interviews is another effective way on how to gather the data about the risk. You interview subject matter experts, SMEs, either internal in your organization or external to your organization. So when we talk about interviews, it is not only about the project team members. You can have someone from outside the project team members. Prompt list, I find it personally very useful, and I always start my assessment of risks on any project by using prompt list. Prompt list means they are historical risks categorized using different categories, and more or less they refer to external risks, such as many of you are familiar with the PEST tool, which refers to political factors, environmental risks, social, technological. Some of you use more advanced formula like the VOCA, I think, which is VOCA, let me write it here, which stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. So this is usually list gathered about risk that happened on a previous projects, and you assume that the same risks might happen on your project. However, if you are referring to projects within your organization, then you can use what we call a checklist, and I'll show you a template in a while. The difference between risk checklist and prompt list, the prompt list usually is categorized, as I said here, according to external categories like political, economical, and such. But risk checklist, it's based on historical similar projects that you worked at before. And data analysis then is very important. It's not enough only to gather the data. You need to analyze it in order to identify the sources of the risks. So root cause analysis is a generic term. Many of you are familiar, for example, under root cause analysis with the 80-20 rule or Pareto rule. We also use Ishikawa or fishbone analysis to find the root cause of the problem, or here we apply to find the root cause of the risks that might happen on our project. Assumption analysis is another source of data that need to be analyzed, where we need to uh, analyze the assumptions, their validity, are they valid or not? If they are true, then what would be the consequence of my project? Remember, when we start a project, it's all about uncertainty. It's all about something new, unique. So we need to make sure that what are the assumptions that we have on the project and keep visiting them every now and then to validate them. SWOT analysis is the most famous acronym, of course, in management. SWOT stands for strength, weaknesses, which basically are the internal risks to the organization, and OT, opportunities and threats, which is basically the external threats. So we can use the SWOT analysis also to see if we have external or internal risks, and document refer to any project document that you might have, such as project charter, scope statement, anything that you need to, any contract even, you need to analyze in order to see if there are risks. The idea here that I want to emphasize, do not worry about identifying hundreds of risks at this stage, because later on they will be filtered when you do quantitative and qualitative analysis. So it is okay to have and record many risks on my risk register at this stage, because when we start the analysis, some of the risks will go away. Some of them will be carried to what we call a watch list, where we store and save the low priority risks of low probability and impact. Some of them will not be valid anymore. But at this stage, we are interested in getting to know as much as possible about the risk that we might encounter on our project. Let me share with you quickly a risk checklist here. Okay, I hope that you can see the risk checklist here. So basically, you are listing risks that you encountered on previous projects, and you are categorizing them under staff, equipment, customer, and such. And then you can start using these risks on your project. Some of them might go to the risk register. Some of them might just, you would think that they are not important to my project. So the risk checklist, the difference between it and the prompt list, the prompt list is all about something that is outside your organization, and the checklist is something that more relates to similar projects within your organization. Okay, and it goes like this. You can see that I listed some risks under scope, technology, delivery. It really differs from one project to another. Let me check if you have any questions here before I share the last important thing about risk identification. So what is PIST? Someone is asking, Muhammad. PIST stands for P, political issues, E, economical, and S for social and technological. Let me write it here. And someone also asked me about the VOCA. So I will write it here. Okay. So the PEST stands for political. So sometimes we have risks related to politics and such, and we've seen this in the past many times. Something related to economics. Okay. Okay. And the other one, social, and T for technological. And frankly speaking, there are more than 100 variations of the PEST. There is PEST lead, and we add sometimes legal, we add industry, but this is the most common one. VOCA, I will just record it here. VOCA stands for volatility, and the U stands for uncertainty that you have in your project, complexity of the project, and complexities need to be noted down, and ambiguity, things that are unclear on your projects. So these are different frameworks for risk assessment. No matter how and what framework you use, we reach a point here, you start recording your risks on the risk register. I want you to listen carefully to this because it's very important. When you record the risk register on the risk on the risk registers, you want to make sure that you record it as a risk statement. Now, what does it mean, a risk statement? I'll come back to some questions. I can see some of you had some questions. I will answer them in a while. So risk statement means cause, risk, effect format. What does it mean? Now, I identified the risk, but when I record it on the risk register, to make my life easy and the life of all my project team members, I need to record the risk following this syntax or format: cause, risk, and effect. Why? Because at a later stage, I will develop some strategies either to deal with the causes of the risk to make sure that I get rid of the risks or enhance it if it's a positive risk, or I will deal with the effect of the risk to make sure that I minimize the impact, or I make sure that I exploit the impact if it is a positive risks. So what does it mean, risk, cause, risk, effect? To differentiate risks from facts and from other things, we use this specifically format. Let me show it to you and give you an example. When you record it on the risk register, you need to be very clear in how you write your and phrase your risk statement. So for example, you follow this format: as a result of, and then you mention your cause. Uncertain event may occur which could may lead to an effect. Why do we want it this way? Here you go, because you have listed the causes of the risk, you have listed the impact or the effect of the risk, and this is what we referred earlier as a risk event, uncertain. So remember when I said that risk is a function of two things: probability and impact. So when you are having on the risk register this clear definition of your risk, you will look at the probability of what will happen on the project and try to reduce it or increase it depending if it is positive or negative. You will also look at the impact and try to increase it or decrease it. So let me show you why we do that. I'll show you a very nice template here. Okay, I hope you can see this. So if you notice, many of you, when they record their risk on the risk register, they only describe the risk. But what I want you to do, consider in the future, when you type it, you record the risk as cause, risk, and effect. Why? Because basically, when you start doing quantitative and qualitative analysis, you'll have to assign a probability that relates to the cause of the threat, and you'll have to assign an impact that relates to the effect of the threat, and then multiplying them together, you'll get your risk score, and then you can start ranking the risks and such. So this is why we need the risk statement to be described as cause, risk, effect template. So later you can have different scale for probability and impact, either qualitative or quantitative. So you can say, for example, that I will have low, medium, high, or I have a numeric scale, and you use it to rate your threats. So that's why we want it as a cause, risk, and effect. I will show you one example here, and you will understand clearly what I mean. So if you look at this risk statement, I will read it very quickly. As a result of lack of a clear direction for the scope of work for the XYZ component. So this will be what? This will be the cause. Okay. As a result, remember, after as a result, you type or record your cause. There could be rework and wasted effort, and this will be my risk, the uncertain event that will lead to the impact, which is delay the project completion from 2 to 4 weeks, which is my effect. So whenever you record your risks on the risk register following this template, This will be very nice because it will help you later to either develop strategies to deal with the causes of the risk or the effects of the risk, and you can easily distinguish between cause, risk, and effect. So this is concludes actually the risk identification part. The output here simply will be your risk register with all the identified risks, maybe potential risk owner, potential risk responses, but they will be confirmed later during developing response strategies. Before we start making qualitative and qualitative analysis, let me check your questions. So Ali is asking, risks for the checklist can also come from method statement of how we got. Yes, they can. This can come from the checklist. They can come from the prompt list, and some of them, as I said, will be carried to the risk register. And method statement, if I understood you clearly here, maybe you refer to scope statement and such is. This can be actually risk are the initial risk usually are recorded as well on the project charter and the scope statement, and then later when the project manager develop the risk register, they need to carry them into the risk register. Another question here, a very important question, actually. Someone is asking, Tariq is asking about when do we usually do risk identification and assessment? It will be done from the minute you accept to be part of the project. From the minute you accept the project charter that authorizes you to start the project, you need to start thinking of risk identification. And this step will continue with you until the end of the project. Every time the scope changes, every time something changes, lots of, for example, scope changes or requests from stakeholders happens on the project, you need to stop with the team and start another round of risk identification. And once you identify the risk, again, you need to assess them either quantitatively or qualitatively. So the first meeting, the kickoff meeting, will have some discussions on risk, but risks should be an agenda on the meeting of all project team members. If you are meeting on a daily basis, a weekly basis, you always need to make sure that you are reassessing the risks, because maybe you identify the risk at the beginning of your project, but during the project life cycle, things change, the probability and the impact change. So you need to account for that. Remember, at the beginning of the project, the risks probability will be very high, but their impact will be very low. As you move on with your project until you reach closing the project, the impact of your risks will be very high and the probability will be very low. So we need always to have risk identification. That's why I said that it is a dynamic approach and not a static one. Another question, a last one here. How can you know what risk assessments to use in your project? Well, actually, that will be covered now. If you are using quantitative or qualitative, there are advantages for each, and you need to check different factors before you make the decision whether to assess quantitatively or qualitatively. So let me move on and start qualitative. You'll see it very interesting now. Now, imagine with me, we recorded all the risks on the risk register. Now we need to decide, are we going to do a qualitative or quantitative risk assessment? And what is the difference between them? Many of my clients, they prefer to jump from identification of risk to quantitative. Why? Without doing qualitative, because they think that the risks are important for them and the project is important, crucial for them, and they want to do the quantitative, which is more accurate. Many of them might say, no, I don't want to do quantitative because it will cost more effort and time. This is a quick comparison between qualitative and qualitative risk assessment. Basically, you can read it later on, but keep in mind, when you are doing qualitative assessment, what does it mean? You're not using numbers, simple as that. You're using a qualitative scale, a scale of low, medium, high to evaluate and assess the probability and the impact of the risks that are listed on your risk register. So you are looking at each individual risk. You will have a risk score, for example, low, medium, high probability, impact and such. And this will help you to rank the risks on your project risk register. But qualitative risk assessment cannot give you the overall project risk score simply because you're not dealing with numbers and you cannot sum all the individual risk scores. But it will help you definitely to see if you need to do quantitative or not. It will help you to do priorities about the individual risks. So not all risks that are listed on the risk register we need to do on them quantitative. Your decision might be, out of the 100 risks you have, I'll have 50 risks or 60 risks that I will assess them qualitatively, but there are some important risks to me that I will do them using quantitative risk analysis. So it's not on or off. It's not, either I move completely with qualitative or quantitative. The advantage of quantitative risk analysis is that it can give you the overall assessment of a project risk score because you are dealing with numbers here. The scale becomes a 0 to 100, a 0 to a 10. So you start assessing the probability and the impact of each individual risk using numbers. And then you can do also Monte Carlo analysis, which I'll show you a sample of them now, and you can check how much these risks will impact my project time and cost and budget. So quantitative definitely is more accurate than qualitative, but it will require effort, it will require investment in some softwares and such. Qualitative, the advantages of it, it's easy to use, easy to understand, and give you quicker results. The decision whether to use qualitative or quantitative will depend on so many factors, not to mention stakeholder tolerance, not to mention, the complexity of the project, many other factors that will let you decide whether to go with the qualitative or quantitative. Let me share with you the qualitative, and then we move to quantitative, and then you see the difference between them. So under qualitative risk assessment, there are certain tools and techniques that I want you to be familiar with. So you need to make sure that you are rating the risks that you listed on the risk register. And here to do that, you will use the probability impact assessment, which is a rating scale. It can be low, medium, or high. And also you'll use the heat matrix, the one I showed you earlier. We can also use bubble charts or hierarchical charts, and I'll show you a sample of these. So you collect the data, and then you assess based on that. Let me show you what does all of this mean. I prepared some samples here. So the first step in a qualitative, you need to agree with the project team members and the stakeholders on the scale. The most common and frequently used scale is a 3-point scale, low, medium, and high. So you need to agree on a probability scale and then on an impact scale. Why is this qualitative? Because there are no numbers. If you refer to a risk listed on your risk register as having a high probability of occurrence, what does it mean? We understand that it means it's a critical, it will occur frequently because it has occurred in the past. On the other hand, if you refer to something as having low probability of occurrence, it means it's negligible and it will not likely occur and such. These definitions need to be stated on the risk management plan as you've seen earlier at the beginning of the webinar. Same you did with the probability, you need to do with the impact. You need to develop an impact scale. If you adopted a 3-point scale for probability, you should adopt a 3-point scale for impact as well. But the impact here, when you say high impact, that means it's a critical, and the definition, of course, will be different. A consequence that will cause loss or cause severe interruptions and such. So the idea here, you are not dealing with numbers, but you want to make sure that you are avoid being biased by having a clear definition of your qualitative scale. The output of this will be something like that. So you see that here, I also introduce impact ratings, but in relation to different project domains or constraints. So when you talk about the impact related to cost, you need to measure it by the project budget. If you say that it will have low impact on the project budget, it means that it will have less than 5% increase, for example. However, when you talk about quality, we're talking about the unit of measurement will be failures here. So it doesn't make sense that you have the same impact unit of measurement for all project domains. You need to have different units of measurement depending on the project constraint that you are using. The output of qualitative will be, simply something like that. So you can see here that I listed some risks on a risk register, a simple one. I did a qualitative assessment of the probability of each one of them, M standing for medium, L for low, H for high, and I assessed the impact as well. Now, the overall risk is basically multiplying your probability by impact. So how can that help me? What do I gain from this? After you are done using Excel, you will re-rank the risks using the individual risk scores. So anything that is high, for example, will be ranked right here on the top. Anything that is low, probability low impact will be at the bottom of your table, and you can later decide to take it out from the risk register to something we call watch list. Why do they call it watch list? Because it includes only low priority risks, low probability, low impact risks, and we refer to it as a watch list because we are going to watch it if a probability and impact of these risks change, increase, then we move them again to the risk register. Why do we do that? Because we don't want to waste our time monitoring, hundreds and thousands of risks on the risk register. So the outcomes of the qualitative assessment of risks is to re-rank your risks listed on the risk register, to know what risks will go to the watch list, and also to help you develop some responses. You might even see something that is very high in probability and impact and decide to take an immediate action without even doing quantitative assessment. Here, again, I'm emphasizing the matrix of risk assessment. So anything that will be here when you do the qualitative assessment, it will be considered as low risk. Anything that will be here, it will consider in this area as a high risk, and the one in the middle, of course, moderate risk. So you can use the matrix in order to assess the individual risks and plot them on the heat matrix and decide based on that, are you going to continue with the project or take certain actions. This is another example from the PMBOK, which is the project management body of knowledge. And you can see here, I like what's on the screen. There is sort of mirroring here. So we have a risk assessment for threats, but we have risk assessment for opportunities, positive risks. So here, you want your risk scores to be as low as possible because they are threats. But at the other side, you want your risk scores to be as high as possible because they are what? Opportunities. It's worth mentioning here that many organizations now are adopting a new trend, actually, not only risk register, but opportunity register. They try to move the opportunities to a different register to make sure that the project team can think of some opportunities that might happen on the project. Because if we keep both the threats and opportunities on the same risk register, as humans, we will only, or psychologically speaking, we will only focus on negative risks and forget some opportunities or positive risks. So this is how it works. So another tool for qualitative risk assessment is what we call a bubble chart, which is part of hierarchical charts. I mean, if you use Excel, and in Excel you can plot these risks. And what I like about bubble charts here, it can give you more than 3 dimensions actually, and to use in your risk assessment. For example, you have one dimension, which is the vertical axis, indicating the proximity of the risk. Another one, the detectability, or it can be probability and impact. And also a third dimension would be the size of the bubble. Maybe the size will indicate the risk score. And also the color of the bubble. I don't have colors here, but if you have colored bubbles here, it can indicate certain categories, for example, of risk. So bubble charts can give us more flexibility in risk assessment rather than just having the standard, heat matrix, which is X and Y axis. Here you can add more dimensions to your risk assessment. And that will be the bubble chart. It's imperative also, again, to do data assessment. Remember, the quality of the output of the qualitative assessment will depend on the quality of the input that you feed to the qualitative assessment. So always check your data. Is it valid or not? Is it reliable or not? What was the source of the data that you used in order to do the qualitative risk assessment? And risk urgency assessment is very important because while you are doing the qualitative, you might see that there is a priority indicators that you need to take some action immediately, even before you do developing strategies and quantitative analysis and such. So here we consider 3 factors, which is the time to execute a risk response. The more near we need to execute a risk response, that means it's urgent. The triggers or warning signs and the risk rating, if it is high, it indicates that there is a priority here and we cannot wait until we reach the developed strategies step, and we need to take an action now. So what will be the output of all of this? Your risk register will be updated again with the ranked risks on your risk register, grouped by categories, the watch list that contain the low priority items, and any qualitative trends that you might have on the project. Any questions here on the qualitative before I show you the quantitative risk assessment? Any questions here? We are doing well regarding time because the remaining will not take us as much time as before. But any questions here? Okay, let me move with quantitative. You will really like it now because we'll use some advanced methods and techniques. Remember, it will take time, it will take effort, and not necessarily that you will do quantitative on every project. So a quantitative risk analysis, simply speaking, this is an overview. You need to do some interviews with your stakeholders. stakeholders and subject matter expert. Then you feed their input into a software. Okay, the software will create a probability distribution, and we have hundreds of them: the bell shape, the normal distribution, the triangular one. And based on that, it will display some output for you. What does it mean, sensitivity analysis? I'll show you a sample now. Decision tree analysis, the Monte Carlo one simulation, EMV, expected monetary value. So these are quantitative methods on analyzing your project risks. It's very easy, but you need to be familiar with some terminologies, the probability distribution, and some softwares that can help you to do quantitative risk analysis. So when you interview, the recommendation is always to interview more than one subject matter expert to get their input on the probability and impact on the risks listed on your risk register. So usually we use the PERT, which is a project evaluation review technique, or we refer to it simply as the 3-point estimate. Why? We will go to our experts or team members or stakeholders with the risk register and tell them, please, can you give us your estimate about the probability and the impact of all these risks? And we will try as much as possible to get an input from someone who is optimistic, someone who is pessimistic, and someone who is in the middle most likely. Why? Because we will feed this into the software and it will create a probability distribution and will help us understand how these risks can impact our projects. So probability distribution, usually the most famous one that we use is the normal one or beta distribution or the paired, but you have thousands of them. Now, some might ask, which one I should choose? It depends on so many factors. If you are interested in this topic, I can share with you later on a document that tells you when to use each one of these distributions. Shall I use continuous distribution or a discrete distribution, and which one and which type? So there are many factors here that you need to consider. So what will happen? The software basically will start multiplying probability by impact to get what we call the risk score, or the EMV, which stands for expected monetary value for each risk on your risk register. But it will not do it like we do it using, simple analysis. What we use, sometimes we refer to it as deterministic approach. You multiply a probability by impact and it gives you a risk score. The software, however, the quantitative one, it will give you what we call a stochastic or probabilistic evaluation of your project. So it will give you thousands and thousands of iterations to let you know how much these risks will impact your project cost or a project type. So what you do usually in a project is a simple analysis like this. You list your risks, you have the impact of each risk, you have the probability, you multiply them to get what we call the EMV, or basically the risk score. And then you add all these amounts to know how much on top of the project budget you need to add, which we refer to as contingency reserve. But with a stochastic or quantitative analysis, you don't need to do that. You can use a more advanced method that will give you more and more iterations. So this one is good for simple projects where complexities are not much. So here I multiplied 5,000 times 10 because it's a negative risk. It is having a sign of negative. If it is a positive risk, it means that I'm saving on the project, so it is a positive amount. If your project budget is 1,000, it means that these risks with the probability and the impact that you used earlier means that it will cost you $800 more that you need to add on the 1,000 of a project budget. But the most advanced one is not this one. I will show you now the simulation and how it works if you want to do a very good quantitative analysis. Quantitative analysis, the need is software, and Excel can help you, but there are more advanced software that comes at certain cost. These softwares will help you to do some sensitivity analysis or what if analysis, basically changing one parameter on the project. How would it affect my project time and cost? And the most famous form of sensitivity analysis, what we call a tornado diagram, because it takes the shape of a tornado. I'll show you an image, but then I will also show you very quick demo, 2 minutes on the software to show you how a tornado diagram will be done using the software. So you can tell here that I have my project risks. Some of them will have positive impact, some of them will have negative impact. It takes a shape of a tornado, and that's why we refer to it as a tornado diagram. And the software will be able to tell you which risk is contributing more to the impact of on the project objective time or cost and such. We also have, using the software and quantitative analysis, what we call decision tree analysis. Basically, you look at the probability of certain scenarios, and again, you consider all the probable scenarios, and then you check how would that impact your project objectives. So this is a sample on the decision tree. So for example, I want to decide whether I go this option or with this option on the project. So the decision tree, it will have a probability and the impact of each decision that you take on the project. You multiply the probability by the impact, it gives you a certain outcome. And then you solve the decision tree, all of it, to give you a decision whether I want, for example, to build or upgrade. To do that manually, it will take lots of time. We have softwares that can help you. Basically, I will show you a very nice software now. You can download it, experiment with it, and it can do decision tree for you. It can do tornado. It can do Monte Carlo analysis that I will share with you now as well. So all of these comes under what we call a simulation, and the most famous one is Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo is not the name of a software. It's the name of the technique. It basically do thousands of iterations on the project model, where you feed the risks into the model, and it will do thousands of iterations to show you how would these risks impact your project time or cost. It has limitations, but it is a very nice one when you are doing quantitative analysis and being adopted by many regional organizations as well. Let me show you one last report here before I show you the demo. So for example, if someone asks you on the project, what is the probability of meeting a project cost of 2.2 million, from the simulation, we know that there is a 23% chance of meeting this target. This can be cost, or you can have time and duration. For example, if someone asks you, what is the how are our chances to meet a target of 2.45 million on this project, and you can say here that it is almost like 85% or such. It takes usually a shape of a S-curve, and this will be a range of uncertainty. It depends whether you want to be 99% having confidence level or 95 and such. Where we did a quantitative risk assessment, and this will be the updates on the risk register. We will have the total project risk score and the assessment of the risk. Now, the most important part of our journey comes now, because we want to make sure that we develop responses for these risks. So if we have time at the end, if you are interested, I can show you again with the Monte Carlo simulation if it works. If not, I'll email you a link and you can just experiment with it. So what does it mean, risk response planning? This is very brief and very straightforward now. You reach a point on your risk register where you listed all your risks, be it negative or positive. So you need to start thinking, if these risks are to happen, about to happen, how I'm going to respond to them. So most international standards, they develop the following risks strategies for dealing with threats. And many of you are familiar with them. Escalate basically means that as a project manager, I don't have the authority to take an action, either preventive or corrective. So I will just escalate it to the upper management, simple as that. Now, we prefer with majority of our risks to avoid them, but sometimes the cost of avoiding a certain risk is higher than the impact of the risk itself. So we do not use avoid, but avoid basically always remember in terms of probability and impact. What does it mean? You are reducing the probability of the risk to a zero, because you are eliminating the cause of the risk. Transfer means basically that you are having a third party that will carry the impact on your behalf. So most famous one example is insurances and warranties and guarantees. It doesn't mean that the probability will change, but the impact will be carried by a third party. Mitigate or reduce, it means that we will live with the probability or impact of the risk, but we will try to do something in order to reduce their effects on the project. And then we accept. If you try all of these on the top and nothing happens, sometimes you need to live with certain risks that you cannot do anything to eliminate them. You need to live with them. But there are two types of acceptance here. Either you are passive, you do nothing at all, or either you are active acceptance, which means that you put additional some money to deal with some of your risks and threats. Now the question, which one to use? Again, it will depend on the appetite of your stakeholders. Remember when we said that if the stakeholder are completely risk averse, you will see that this will translate on the risk register by having more of avoid, escalate, and transfer, for example. If the stakeholders, they are embracing opportunities and they have a risk-seeking attitude, then you might find that you can use sometimes mitigate and accept. It depends also on the cost involved in these strategies. But these are the most famous labels here, and underneath each one of them can come thousands of examples. However, remember that for these strategies, you are trying to reduce the probability and the impact as much as possible. Now, for opportunities, the idea is to enhance the opportunity, to make sure that it will happen and you benefit from it. To do that, again, we can escalate to upper management. We see an opportunity, but we cannot do anything to enhance it. Exploit means you take every measure in order to utilize and fully utilize the opportunity, take full advantage of it. Share is like joint ventures and such. There is an opportunity, but for example, I need to share it with someone else. Could be another department. If we join together, me and the other department, we can get a higher discount from a certain supplier. Enhance, basically, here you are increasing the probability of something good to happen. So you are playing with the triggers and enhancing the probability of something good to happen. For example, all the advertisements that you see sometimes on TV or streets, they advertise companies because they want you to look at their ad, and then that will enhance the probability that you will deal with them. And sometimes you do nothing in order to enhance or exploit the opportunity, and this is what we call accept. The idea here, bottom line here, you want to make sure that you have the opportunities and you have the threats and strategies. Remember, the opportunities is to increase the um, probability and impact of the risks, and the threats is to decrease the probability and the impact of the risks. And I summarize them under what we call CMAT acronym here. We are running ahead of our time here. So very briefly, I will just conclude with this, and we need almost like 5 minutes to finish this webinar. So remember that when you are developing the strategies, you need to factor that into your project budget. So contingency reserve is basically what we call a reserve that deal with the known unknowns. All the risks that you identified on your risk register, you need to have some amount of money that you put on top of the project budget to deal with the risks, and this will be factored within your project budget. However, on the other hand, we have management reserve, which is to deal with unknown. Basically, unknown, any unforeseen events that we did not expect to encounter on our projects, and to deal with them, we put aside some management reserve. Project managers usually are not empowered or authorized to spend from the management reserve, but however, they can spend from the contingency reserve. And many organizations are keeping one management reserve for all their projects under the organization. Fallback plan means contingency plan, so plan B. So if the original plan did not work, so we develop a plan B, which is again could be avoid or mitigate, but we refer to it under the terminology of the standard as a fallback plan. So think of it as a secondary plan. So residual risks are all the risks that will remain on your risk register. If you try to avoid and eliminate the risk, still it is there, then we refer to it as residual risk. And secondary risk are actually the risks that will arise as a consequence of implementing a certain risk response. So these are terminologies that you need to be familiar with when you are working with the project risk management. The output of this basically will be all your risk register will be updated with the fallback plan, residual risk, secondary risk. You'll have the triggers, you'll have the owners, you'll have the estimates. So once you are done here with the response planning, you are done with the risk register. However, the last step is just to make sure that you monitor your risks. How to do that? I have only 2 slides to share with you here. You need to make sure that you have a risk reassessment and audit. On a frequently basis, you need to reassess during the project execution the probability again and impact of your existing risks. Risk audits, however, they had to do with the risk responses and the effectiveness of the risk management processes. Usually the project management officers, PMOs, they examine the effectiveness of your responses and management processes and the effectiveness of the risk owners and such, so that they can update lessons learned and learn from it. And don't forget as a last remark here, that you need to have some key performance indicators when you are dealing with the project risks. Many of you are familiar with these KPIs here related to earned value analysis, such as cost performance index, cost variance, and such. There is a formula for each one of them, and we have a threshold for each one of them. Just as one last example, CPI means cost performance index. So our reference point for it is it should equal to 1. If, however, it increase more than 1 or decrease more than 1 with a certain limit, either by 10% or decrease by 10%, that will make us alert that there is a risk that we will not be on budget, because cost performance index can tell you if you are going to be over or under your budget. So the idea, you need to develop KPIs. There is a standard, there are standards, about risk KPIs and most risk libraries and PMO libraries, and you can adopt many of them. Again, I apologize for the lengthy webinar. I hope it was beneficial. But the last thing here is the reserve analysis, where every time you spend from your contingency or management reserve, you need to check that the remaining amount of the contingency reserve is sufficient to handle all the remaining risks on your risk register. So this is what we call risk reserve, and I think this concludes our webinar. The last thing I wanted to share with you here, that remember that in every status meeting you need to discuss risks on the projects, and sometimes you will end up having to do what we call workarounds, which is basically responding to negative risks that occurred, but they were not on our risk register. So this is basically the output of the monitor risk. You will have the actual outcome of all the risk responses, and you can summarize a risk report and give it to your stakeholders so they know what's happening on the project. Remember that risk should be management, it should be a philosophy. Everyone in the organization, in the project management team, should be aware of the methodology of how to manage a project risk. It's a dynamic approach. You keep working on it until the end of the project. And remember that there's nothing called risk-free project. Risk is always there, but ask yourself, are we being effective in managing our risks or not? I thank you so much for your time, and I'll open the floor now for any more questions. You have my email on the screen, and also when you get the recording of the webinar, should you have any questions in the future, please do email me and I'll make sure to respond to you. If you wish to have copies of the templates that I shared with you and more, also email me and I'll be more than happy to share it with you. I will open for the floor for questions for a couple of minutes. Anyone who has questions, please let me know. Any questions? I think on the question here, the chat, Q&A chat, I answered all of them, but enjoy your weekend. I wish you a pleasant weekend. I hope that you found the webinar beneficial, and I hope that you will be able to manage your project risks. And that's it. Thank you so much for joining our webinar. Keep in touch, stay safe, and enjoy your weekend. Thank you so much.